Jacob Finn stood at the edge of the ravine, eyes scanning the jagged cliffs that stretched down into darkness. Somewhere below, the Draken lurked, an apex predator known across the galaxy for its ability to shred starships with its claws. A group of elite alien hunters, their faces drawn and exhausted, stood behind him. Their advanced equipment had proven useless, and now, the last hope for freeing the creature rested on a human farmer from Earth. "Are you sure you want to do this?" asked Taurek, the lead hunter, his voice thick with skepticism. His tall, angular form bristled with impatience, his shimmering armor gleaming under the planet's twin suns. "We've tried everything. That thing is a monster. I don't see how a farmer could." "I've handled worse," Jacob interrupted, his voice calm but firm. He pulled a simple rope from his pack, looping it around his shoulder with practiced ease. His worn boots crunched against the loose gravel as he edged closer to the precipice. "Sometimes it's not about power or tech. You just have to understand them." Taurek muttered something in his native tongue, but Jacob didn't listen. He knew their doubts, had heard them before from soldiers, hunters, even diplomats. What could a simple human farmer know that their sophisticated tools couldn't reveal? But Jacob had seen those tools fail before, and he wasn't here to argue. He was here to work. The ravine yawned before him, deep and shadowed, the air thick with the scent of moss and damp stone. The alien jungles of Varnak pulsed with strange life. Somewhere in the distance, a low growl reverberated off the cliffs, followed by the sound of scraping claws on rock. There it was. The Draken. Jacob crouched at the edge, peering down into the dark where the massive predator moved restlessly. Its scales shimmered faintly, reflecting the light in jagged streaks as it paced within its prison of rock. From here, the creature looked every bit as dangerous as the stories had painted it. Claws the size of spears, fangs glinting like knives, and those eyes, feral, calculating, watching. Yet Jacob saw something else beneath the surface. Fear. "Is it agitated?" one of the younger hunters asked, his voice trembling. The others had fallen silent, watching Jacob as if expecting him to be devoured the moment he descended. Jacob nodded, more to himself than to them. "It's cornered. That's why your tech didn't work. You made it feel trapped. We tried sedatives, tranquilizers, everything," Taurek snapped. "And it attacked everything we sent down there." Jacob shrugged. "Yeah, because you came at it like it was a problem to be solved, not a creature to be understood." He pulled the rope tight, checking the knots before slinging it over the ledge. With a practiced motion, he began his descent. The rocks shifted underfoot, the rope creaking with his weight as he carefully lowered himself toward the creature. The Draken growled again, a low, dangerous sound that vibrated through the stone. Jacob slowed his descent, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He needed the beast to see him, not as a threat, but as something different from the hunters and their weapons. When he finally touched down on the narrow ledge below, the Draken was watching him intently, its golden eyes tracking his every move. Jacob stayed still, his heartbeat steady as he assessed the situation. He'd worked with stubborn animals all his life, stallions, bulls, wild dogs, but none of them compared to this. Still, he recognized the signs. The tension in the beast's coiled muscles, the way its tail flicked nervously against the rock. It wasn't rage that fueled the Draken's aggression, it was fear. Slowly, Jacob reached into his pack and pulled out a chunk of raw meat he'd brought from the ship's stores. He tossed it a few feet from the Draken, then waited. The hunters, watching from above, murmured in disbelief. The Draken's nostrils flared. It sniffed the air, hesitated, then lunged forward and devoured the offering in a single bite. Jacob didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pack again, offering more food, this time a little closer. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the hunter's gaze as they watched him work. Minutes passed in silence. Jacob didn't rush. Each movement was calculated, each offering a step toward trust. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Draken's growls softened. Its massive head dipped slightly, and its eyes no longer burned with the same wild fury. Jacob took a step closer. The hunters gasped audibly, but Jacob remained calm, his movements slow and deliberate. He stretched out his hand, palm open, and held his breath as the Draken's great snout came closer. For a moment, he thought it might snap at him, but instead, it nudged his palm, cautious, curious. He exhaled softly, relief flooding through him. The bond was fragile, but it was there. He had earned its trust. From above, Talrek's voice echoed down, barely masking his disbelief. How did you do that? Jacob smiled faintly, keeping his focus on the Draken. It's just about listening. You were trying to dominate it. Sometimes, all it takes is patience. The Draken let out a low rumble, a sound that no longer felt like a threat. Jacob took another step forward, his heart steady as he reached for the ropes that would guide the creature to safety. The hardest part was over, but the work had just begun. As he prepared to lead the galaxy's deadliest predator to freedom, Jacob couldn't help but wonder what these aliens might learn from a simple human farmer. Jacob tightened the ropes around the Draken's neck, careful not to pull too hard. The creature's scales gleamed in the fading light, catching glints of orange and red as the twin suns of Varnak sank beneath the horizon. The Draken remained still, its enormous golden eyes watching him with an unsettling intelligence. Jacob could feel the tension in the air, not just from the beasts but from the alien hunters hovering above, waiting for something, anything, to go wrong. I still can't believe you got it to calm down, Talrek muttered, his voice low but edged with disbelief. He stood at the top of the ravine, arms crossed, his sharp eyes fixed on Jacob's every movement. Behind him, the other hunters murmured to each other, their arrogance slowly dissolving into something closer to respect, though none of them would admit it yet. Jacob didn't respond. His attention was solely on the Draken. The rope was sturdy, but he knew any sudden movement could send the creature into another fit of rage, undoing hours of careful trust building. His hands moved steadily, threading the final knot, his fingers rough from years of work on Earth's farms. The Draken exhaled a low rumble, and Jacob stilled, letting the beast settle before continuing. Talrek's impatience flared again. Is this really necessary? We could have had it out of there by now with one of our extraction drones. You're wasting. It's not a machine, Jacob said, cutting him off. He didn't look up. You can't just drag it out like a broken vehicle. You've got to let it think it's making the decision. The Draken's large head shifted slightly, its nostrils flaring as it scented the air, and Jacob froze. He could feel its raw power just beneath the surface, a predator that could tear through anything, or anyone, if provoked. Yet there was something more now. That fierce, unyielding aggression had softened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. The beast was learning to trust him, and that fragile trust was the only thing keeping them all alive. Your tech doesn't work because it sees you as a threat, Jacob added, finally standing up. You tried to control it. Creatures like this. He glanced at the Draken, meeting its gaze for the first time since he'd begun. They don't bow to force. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but no one challenged him. Jacob took a slow, deep breath and tugged gently on the ropes, testing the weight. The Draken shifted but didn't resist, and he began to lead it forward, one careful step at a time. The hunters above leaned in, their disbelief giving way to awe. Talrek's eyes narrowed, and Jacob could tell the alien leader was struggling to reconcile what he was witnessing. This human, this farmer, was doing what their entire team of trained experts and high-tech tools couldn't. Jacob was taming the untamable. The jungle around them was alive with strange sounds, the distant cries of alien creatures, the rustling of massive leaves in the wind, but to Jacob, it was as familiar as any farm he'd worked on Earth. The way the Draken moved, the way it hesitated at certain points and grew bolder at others, reminded him of the horses and bulls he'd worked with for years. Only, this creature could tear through reinforced steel if it chose to. As they neared the slope that would lead them out of the ravine, Jacob could sense the Draken growing uneasy again. The incline was steep, the rocks loose beneath its massive feet. It growled low in its throat, a warning, and Jacob slowed his pace, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. You're almost out, Jacob murmured, not sure if the beast could understand the words but knowing it could sense his calm. Just a little further. The Draken hesitated, its claws scraping against the stone, and Jacob felt the rope pull taut in his hands. His heart pounded, but he didn't let it show. He had to keep steady. Any sign of fear could trigger the predator's instincts. From above, one of the younger hunters spoke in a hushed tone. It's actually listening to him." Taurek didn't respond, his face a mask of quiet intensity. The draken's head tilted, its golden eyes flickering in the dim light. Then, with a slow, almost deliberate step, it began to climb the slope, its massive body moving with surprising grace. Jacob let out a slow breath, guiding the creature upward, step by step, until they reached the top of the ravine. The moment they crested the edge, the hunters scrambled back, their weapons raised instinctively. But the draken ignored them, its attention fixed on Jacob. It stood beside him, its breathing deep and steady, as if waiting for what would happen next. Jacob dropped the rope and turned to face Taurek, his face calm but tired. "There. It's free." The alien leader stared at the draken for a long moment, his disbelief finally breaking. He lowered his weapon, though his grip on it remained tight. "You've done it." I don't understand how, but you've done it." Jacob wiped the sweat from his brow and shrugged. "It wasn't about me. It was about letting it trust me." The draken shifted beside him, its tail twitching slightly. It no longer growled, no longer bared its teeth. It simply stood there, as if waiting for Jacob's next move. The hunters, once so confident in their technology, now stood in silent awe. Taurek approached, his voice quieter than before. "What happens now? Does it go back to the wild?" Jacob glanced at the draken, then back to Taurek. "Maybe. But something tells me it's not done with us yet." The tension in the air was palpable, but for the first time since Jacob had arrived on this strange world, he felt something shift. The draken was no longer just a predator. It had become something more. And whatever that was, it wasn't going to leave him easily. As the twin suns dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the jungle, Jacob stood with the galaxy's most dangerous creature by his side. And in that moment, he knew this was only the beginning. Jacob stood in the clearing, the jungle of Varnak alive with the sounds of distant creatures. The draken, towering beside him, shifted its weight, its massive tail swishing slowly across the ground. It had been 2 days since the rescue, and the creature hadn't left his side. It followed him as if tethered by some invisible bond, its once ferocious eyes now watching his every move with an eerie calm. The alien hunters kept their distance, always armed, always cautious. Taurek, who had begrudgingly accepted Jacob's success, now hovered nearby, his expression unreadable as he spoke into a communicator. Jacob could feel the tension growing, not just in Taurek, but in the entire camp. The draken's presence was unsettling, a constant reminder of the raw power it possessed. It was no longer a mindless beast, but there was still something primal about it, something that made the air feel heavy with the promise of violence. Jacob knew the hunters didn't trust him, or the creature. And he wasn't sure they were wrong. "Jacob," Taurek called, approaching slowly. His voice was measured, but there was a thin edge of tension beneath it. "The others are nervous. They think you've tamed it, but they don't understand what comes next." Jacob didn't answer right away. He looked at the draken, watching the rise and fall of its breath, the way its muscles rippled beneath its scales. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But it's not just a predator anymore. It's learning." Taurek frowned. "Learning what exactly?" "Us," Jacob said, his voice quiet. "It's watching how we move, how we react. I think it understands more than we realize." The alien leader's eyes narrowed, his distrust evident. "That's exactly what worries me. What if it's biding its time? What if this connection you think you've built is just a temporary pause before it strikes?" Jacob met his gaze. "Maybe. But it hasn't hurt anyone yet." "Yet," Taurek repeated. "And what happens when that changes? You think you can control it when it decides to go feral again?" Jacob didn't like the direction the conversation was heading. The draken wasn't something to be controlled, not in the way Taurek wanted. It wasn't a tool or a weapon, It was a living, thinking being. But the hunters saw things differently. To them, this was still a creature to be subdued, to be handled with force if necessary. "I don't control it," Jacob said. "I trust it. And it trusts me." Talrek's skepticism was palpable. "Trust is dangerous in this situation. You've put your faith in something that could rip through steel like paper." Jacob nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the alien's words. He didn't know if the trust between him and the Draken was strong enough to withstand whatever came next. But he wasn't about to back down. He'd seen something in the creature that the hunters hadn't, a flicker of understanding, of intelligence that was growing with each passing day. If there was a chance to build on that, to truly reach the Draken, he had to try. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the jungle, the tension between Jacob and Talrek deepened. The Draken, as if sensing the unease, let out a low rumble, its massive form shifting closer to Jacob. Talrek stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon strapped to his side. "Easy," Jacob said, raising a hand. "It's just reacting to us." Talrek's eyes darted between Jacob and the Draken, suspicion etched into every line of his face. "You think you have it under control, but if it turns on us, I won't hesitate to take it down." "You won't need to," Jacob said firmly. "But if you treat it like an enemy, it will become one." The moment hung heavy between them, either willing to back down. Finally, Talrek exhaled sharply, turning away to confer with his team. Jacob could feel the eyes of the other hunters on him, their fear mingling with curiosity. He had done the impossible, tamed the galaxy's deadliest predator, but now they were waiting for him to fail, to prove their fears right. As the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Jacob led the Draken away from the group, heading deeper into the jungle. He needed space, time to think. The creature followed without hesitation, its massive form weaving silently between the trees. For a long while, they walked in silence, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of alien wildlife. Jacob could feel the Draken's presence beside him like a shadow, always close, always watching. He wasn't sure how far this bond between them would go, whether it was temporary or something deeper. But there was no denying the connection that had formed. Stopping near a stream, Jacob crouched down to gather his thoughts. The water shimmered in the fading light, cool and clear. The Draken lowered its head to drink, its movements slow and deliberate. Jacob watched it, marveling at how something so dangerous could seem so peaceful. As the last light of the day slipped away, Jacob felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The hunters wouldn't wait forever. Talrek's patience was already thin, and if the Draken showed any sign of aggression, they would strike. Jacob had to find a way to prove that this creature wasn't just a mindless killer. But how? The Draken lifted its head, water dripping from its jaws, and looked at Jacob with those golden eyes, eyes that seemed to hold more than animal instinct. There was something there, something new, something Jacob couldn't quite name. "We'll figure it out," Jacob murmured, more to himself than to the creature. "We have to." The Draken blinked, then nudged Jacob's arm with its snout, gentle, almost playful. For a brief moment, Jacob allowed himself to smile. Maybe, just maybe, they were both learning something after all. But as the night settled in, bringing with it the unknown dangers of the jungle, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. And when it did, their fragile bond would be tested in ways either of them could predict. The jungle was alive with tension, the air thick with anticipation as night closed in around the camp. Jacob could feel the unease in every step the hunters took, their eyes flicking nervously toward the Draken that now lay beside him, coiled like a giant serpent in the underbrush. Its golden eyes gleamed faintly in the darkness, watching the activity around them but making no move to attack. And yet, the threat loomed, unspoken but present. Talrek approached, his jaw clenched. The alien leader was clearly struggling with the decision that had been hanging in the air since sunset. "The Council's given the order, Jacob," he said, voice low but firm. "We have to put it down. They're not willing to take the risk any longer." Jacob's stomach twisted, but he kept his expression calm. He had known this was coming. No matter how much he had proven about the Draken's intelligence and restraint, the hunters saw it only as a danger. Something to be eliminated before it could cause harm. "I thought we had more time," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the rising anger. Taurek's eyes softened, if only for a moment. "It's out of my hands now. They won't wait for it to snap. One wrong move, and it could wipe out half the colony. You know that." Jacob stood, facing the Draken, which now lifted its head, sensing the tension between the two. Its massive form was illuminated by the faint glow of the campfires, casting long shadows that made it look even more ominous. But Jacob didn't see a monster. He saw a creature that had learned, that had bonded with him in ways neither he nor the hunters could fully understand. "I can't let you do this," Jacob said quietly, his heart pounding as he stepped closer to the creature. "There's more to this Draken than you realize. It's not just a predator anymore." Taurek's hand rested on his sidearm, not drawing it yet but ready. "And what if you're wrong? What if it turns on you right now?" Jacob crouched beside the Draken, placing his hand gently on its rough scales. The beast rumbled, a deep sound that reverberated through the ground, but it didn't pull away. Instead, it shifted closer, pressing its head lightly against Jacob's hand. The trust between them was undeniable, and yet it felt fragile, as if it could shatter with one misstep. "I'm not wrong," Jacob said, his voice firm now. "This creature isn't a threat unless you make it one. If you attack, it'll defend itself. But if you leave it be, if you let me show you, it could be something more." Taurek's face tightened with frustration. "You don't understand, Jacob. This isn't about what could be. It's about what's at stake. The Council isn't going to sit by and let you gamble with the lives of thousands." "I'm not gambling," Jacob shot back, standing to face Taurek fully now. "I'm asking you to trust me. To trust what you've seen with your own eyes. It hasn't attacked anyone. It hasn't lashed out, even when it was trapped and cornered. That should tell you something." The alien leader's hesitation was palpable, but the camp behind him stirred with nervous energy. The other hunters were gearing up, preparing for the inevitable. Taurek's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're putting yourself in its path, Jacob. You might not survive this." Jacob's eyes met Taurek's. "I'm not the one in danger." Before Taurek could respond, a deafening roar echoed from the jungle, far more guttural and wild than the Draken's low rumble. The ground trembled as something massive moved through the trees, shaking the canopy above them. The hunters froze, weapons drawn, eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is that?" one of the hunters called out, panic in his voice. A second roar followed, closer this time, and Jacob's heart sank. It wasn't the Draken they had to fear, it was something else entirely. He didn't know what, but the sound alone sent a chill through him, primal and fierce. The Draken, now fully alert, rose to its feet, muscles tense, and eyes locked on the tree line. For the first time, Jacob saw something close to fear in the creature's eyes. "Jacob, get away from it!" Taurek barked, his weapon aimed squarely at the Draken's head. "Now!" But Jacob didn't move. He knew what was coming, and it wasn't the Draken. "No," he said, his voice clear and calm. "It's not the enemy." The roar came again, and then the trees exploded into motion. From the shadows, a massive, six-legged beast crashed into the clearing, its maw dripping with saliva, its eyes wild with hunger. It was twice the size of the Draken, its leathery hide bristling with spikes. The hunters opened fire, the crack of their weapons filling the night, but the creature barely flinched as it barreled toward them. In an instant, the Draken was moving, faster than Jacob had ever seen. It lunged at the creature, colliding with it in a thunderous crash that shook the ground. Claws and teeth tore into each other, and for a moment, Jacob couldn't tell which beast had the upper hand. But then, with a powerful swing of its tail, the Draken sent the other creature sprawling, its body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Jacob stood frozen, watching as the Draken roared, its dominance clear. The other creature, wounded and defeated, retreated into the jungle, vanishing into the shadows. Silence fell over the camp. The Draken, now victorious, turned and locked eyes with Jacob once more. It had defended them. It had chosen to protect. Talrek lowered his weapon, his face pale. By the stars! Jacob took a deep breath, his heart still racing. You see now? He said quietly. It's not just a predator. It's more than that. The Draken rumbled softly, moving closer to Jacob, its presence no longer intimidating but protective. Talrek said nothing for a long moment, his eyes flicking between Jacob and the creature. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll give it more time. Jacob exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. But as he looked at the Draken beside him, he knew this was only the beginning. Something had changed tonight, between him, the creature, and the hunters. And whatever came next, their bond would be tested in ways he couldn't yet foresee.